This is going to be a very informal session, and we hope that we can have some significant participation from the floor, because we're going to move from the broader focus of the future in Australia and globally in the last session to really focusing on South Australia. What does what we've heard today mean for South Australia? What are the particular issues which South Australia faces with respect to migration into the future? And the organisers have actually given us the incredible challenge of coming up with specific recommendations, and I'm not too sure whether that's going to be the case or not. But I think it really is a significant time for us to take a look at population policy more broadly, but also migration in South Australia. If we go back more than 10 years, South Australia was the first jurisdiction in Australia to have its own population policy. And that population policy was evolved by the incoming Rann government because of the ABS projections, which I mentioned earlier today, which showed that even under the median projection, South Australia's population would begin to decline sometime about 2015. This really galvanised the government into action to develop a population policy, which can be criticised on a number of bases, but in many ways is a model of how to develop such a policy, in that it does cover all of the elements of the main population processes: fertility, migration, mortality, population distribution, ageing, and so on. And it treats them in I think, a fairly balanced type of way. It did come up with some projections, some recommendations, which I think were undoable. But in fact, most of the targets that it set itself, it exceeded, particularly with respect to international migration. Now, it did coincide with a period of good economic growth for the state, so it was a bit lucky, but it really did turn around population change within South Australia, and I think has to be judged quite successful. But it was a decade ago, and the world has changed, and South Australia has changed, and I really believe quite strongly that as a state we need to revisit our population policy and come up with some broader thinking about South Australia's population over the next decade or so, and a policy which takes into account the realities of our current economy, but also the opportunities which are offered by global developments and things that we've heard about recently, about the opportunities in agribusiness, the opportunities which are offered by an ageing population, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, that it's usually seen as some sort of a problem. But in fact, the reality is that it offers many opportunities for the state. But migration, international migration, has to be front and centre in any discussion of a population policy for the state. And we have three panellists, and I'm assured by the panellists that they don't want to make initial statements, except Loretta has a brilliant idea. She told me that even though she's from Western Australia, she's willing to share it across the border, and we'll make sure that when we use it and are very successful in South Australia, that we'll give her totally full acknowledgement for it. But maybe we can kick off from hearing from Loretta.
Thank you. That's not exactly what I said to Graeme. I'm sure you'll realise. And maybe in terms of Australian geopolitics, coming from Perth means I am living quite close by. But as my interest is in transnational conceptions of community and transnational ideas about identities, and also an interest in the impact of new technologies, even though we're focusing on South Australia, I think we need to think about South Australia and the rest of the world. My brilliant idea is actually Graeme's. Which was, Graeme, you said at some point that you're interested in the idea of developing development-friendly migration policy, and you said that's about considering the impact of migration policy, not only in terms of the benefits and the values and the issues it has for South Australia or Australia, but also in terms of the sending areas. And I thought about that in a broader way, and in a way that kind of links in also with the previous panel and sustainability. We tend to think about migration primarily in terms of economics and in terms of sustainability. We think about sustainability in terms of the environment. But I think we could adapt your idea about development-friendly migration policy. I'm not sure what to call it, but maybe holistic migration policy, because I think what's often missed out is the impact on the well-being of individuals, families and communities. And so if we had a holistic migration policy that looked at the sustainability and well-being of healthy families, communities and individuals at the forefront and put economics next, maybe we wouldn't have however many thousands of spouses waiting to join their partners, and we might have more parents here. And the parents are those productive elderly people who are so lacking in many new and emerging migrant community families that could add so much support and allow the younger members of the family to join the workforce and so on. So it just gave me a framework to maybe restate the kind of issues that I raised in the panel on community care, because what I also noticed was that when we talked about the numbers and sustainability and labour, the caring issues just get sidelined so easily. The three wise men from the last session had no problem with ageing, which is great, but what about aged care? That is a big issue. And so that was just my building on your idea, Graeme.
Great. One of the things that comes from that is that whenever we get down to talking about the state and migration, is that we're immediately restricted in the sort of levers that are available for the policymakers with respect to migration, because since 1901 and Federation, at the time of Federation, all of the powers to decide on immigration policy were given away by the colonies to the new Federation of Australia. So that's where the power resides in terms of policy. And while there are now mechanisms which exist for the states and territories to have an input into migration discussions, and there have been through the state-specific and regional migration schemes a whole range of options made available which give opportunities for states to capitalise on them and get some concessions with respect to migration. In the end, their ability to make fundamental changes is quite limited. And it is interesting to look at the Canadian model, which was in the past one like ours, where the federal government retained all of the powers, but there has been cases in Canada now where some of those powers have been seceded, and Quebec does some of its own recruiting, for example, using the mechanisms of using the machinery of the federal government, but actually having its own, to some extent, migration policy, and having migration agreements with the Philippines, for example, or with France, or with individual countries. So one of the things which is a possibility into the future, I think, in Australia is actually some decentralisation of decision-making and power within the migration system, beyond the fact that the states are the ones who have to pay for the services and so on that migrants use when they come to the destination. So we've got a big role in terms of the settlement side at the state level, but very little role on the migration side. And perhaps potentially that's one of the things as a nation we need to be looking at, and perhaps opening up new potential for migration by bringing the states into that process. One of the panel members has not been here during the day, but is in my view, especially important to the discussion. Rick Cairney is from Business SA, which is the peak employer body in South Australia, and to me, their role in terms of migration is one which is, I think, very, very important, because the incorporation of migrants into the labour market is absolutely fundamental to the success of migrants, and they've been a strong lobby group in the state over a long period of time now with respect to migration, and I think very often in our discussions of policy they are not, they don't tend to be included, and I think it is important that Rick's here today.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. No, do you want to make a Business SA statement, or are you just...
Oh, look, no, not really. I mean, as I understand, this is a Q&A, and as my wife often says to me, darling, I'd much prefer you listen than talk. So, but seriously, look, we, as you've said, Graeme, have been strong supporters of particularly skilled migration. So I'm more than happy just to run with the Q&A.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the things that, and I am eventually going to throw this open to questions, but I just want to raise a couple of issues which might be taken up. There has been a tendency for us to think about regional migration and special migration schemes purely in terms of the skilled migration category, because that's really what it's been confined to up to now. And I think some of the issues that Loretta raised about family migration is really important, because the fact is that while they're regarded as two separate categories, they really are linked together. And if we're going to be more competitive for the really highly skilled migrants into the future, their ability to bring their family to join them, particularly their parents, is going to be a factor in whether or not they choose to come to Australia or whether they come anywhere else. And whether we can do this at the state level and you know, have some concessions in that respect at the state level, that might be one of the things that would be considered. But I think we need to look at family, because if you look at the results of the analysis done by the ABS and on the two data sets which have been merged, the family migrants are more likely to settle outside of the major areas of concentration of migrants than is the case for skilled migrants. So that's one issue. The other is refugee humanitarian migrants, who really are leading some regional migration developments, not just here in South Australia but elsewhere as well. They're often thought about in totally non-economic terms, yet you know, the economic contribution of this group is huge. They're very often the most innovative groups, and work we did recently you know, just showed that they are on average more likely to set up their own businesses than other migrants. There's also some magnificent success stories, such as our own governor here in South Australia. So to consider refugees almost as a non-players in the relationship between migration and state development is very wrong, I think. But enough from me. Please ask some questions and we'll go from there. Alex?
This might be a crazy thought, but based on Loretta's idea of transnational idea of migration and the federal constraints that Graeme mentioned, I just wonder for South Australia, if we're trying to do something different, one thing we do control at a legal level is voting rights. And I wonder whether for South Australians who leave South Australia and live elsewhere, and whether they retain their right to vote in elections. And also, perhaps, for temporary migrants who have been here for a certain period of time, they get the right to vote, which is a way of getting an investment in the South Australian community, growing connections. It might be crazy, but that just came to me as I saw the constraints that we were working within, and maybe something we could do.
And that's something which, at a national level, has been used a lot these days. With more than half the countries of the world now have got a formal diaspora policy in which they attempt to engage their diaspora in a whole range of areas. And to me, a comprehensive South Australian migration and population policy is one which should engage with diaspora the South Australian diaspora elsewhere in Australia, but also globally, is a really significant and important part of the South Australian population, even though it doesn't live here. And coming up with innovative ideas about their engagement and potential role in the development of the state, I think is certainly an area that does need to be looked at. I failed to introduce every panel member, and I should have. I apologise to Rebecca Greenfield, who has been a long-term employee of the South Australian government in a range of roles, particularly relating to economic development, and has done a fantastic job in running Immigration SA, which is the arm of the state government, which is working on migration. So, welcome, Rebecca. Is there anything that you particularly want to add at this stage?
I guess the main comment I would make about the state-specific regional migration schemes, which is where we participate and we provide nominations for skilled and business migrants. That program, I think, has been very successful, particularly with the release of the population policy in 2004, and that's where we saw our share of skilled migrants that were a very low percentage of the national total, just below 4%. When we started with the release of that population policy and we reinvigorated and increased our participation, we managed to achieve a share of 9.9% of all skilled migrants using those programs. What we have seen over the last, particularly the last 3 years, is a reduction in the effectiveness of that regional dispersal of the national program. So we're down to about, on average, a bit below around the 6% mark. And there's been a lot of national changes. So when Graeme talked about us granting visas, that's exciting. I wouldn't want the cost of doing it or the headaches of doing it, but certainly at the state and territory level, we are keen to try and reinvigorate our ability to influence where migrants are settling regionally outside of the bigger cities. The factor of temporary migration, I think certainly increases our difficulties, because a lot of your temporary migrants, they come in and they settle in the larger cities, and once they're settled, it's that much harder to then attract them to a non-city location. So for us, our target market will be still offshore skilled and business migrants, and those temporary migrants onshore living in South Australia.
Any more comments from the floor? Ross? No, I should, just before Ross starts, I should introduce him as the demographic brains behind the state government. And
Which Geordie? Now, a query for what we're Dipty. Sorry, we are thrown off stride. Dipty, we're in the process of producing a new set of projections. They're very nearly complete, but they have to go to our executive. Haven't done so yet, but they're in the process of going there. And one thing that struck me, because I'm writing the draft report at the moment, is that it looks as if we're going to have a serious decrease in the projected working age population in many of the dryland farming regions of the state. And this is using the old SDs, because we're producing the projections first at that level, and then we'll disaggregate them for the new geography, simply because most agencies still use the old geography in their software. But I'm thinking of the old SDs like Murraylands, South East, Eyre, and the serious loss of working age population, and I can't see how that can be readily reversed, and I was wondering if there are any initiatives that the panel might be able to think of there. I know there's been some successes in regional Victoria with immigrant populations, but this is often the farming population themselves that is ageing. Yeah. And that means you'd have to, what you do, the daughters have left the farm, often the sons don't want to continue in dad's footsteps, and there's a problem there with the actual farm population. I know you need less, as Ian said, than you used to, but that still doesn't probably resolve the issue. And you've also got an environmental concern that it's a managed environment these days, and if you just leave properties, unworked, then you've got problems with feral pests and with weeds and so on. Thank you.
I don't know that I've got your answer in terms of fixing. Excuse me. I apologise for the voice. I'm just getting over this latest flu virus which is floating around. But look, we've been saying to the government, state government in particular, for several years that agriculture should have just as much focus as mining and defence. It's not to say mining and defence are not important, they are, but given from an economic point of view, I'm not saying that we are going to be the food bowl of Asia, but we've got so great opportunities in Asia with ag business and also food and beverage manufacturing premium that, and I think the government's now recognising that. But to us, there needs to be a more of a holistic program, if you want, or focus on agriculture, because, as I said, we've got a great reputation in Asia for clean and green, and they're prepared to pay for it. So the issue of competitiveness is not such a big issue when you're looking at agriculture and food and beverage manufacturing.
I think just a couple of follow-up points there. Deloitte Access Economics just recently published the areas of the Australian economy which they see as being growing over the next decade or so. And agribusiness was the #1 area, and related particularly to the growing demand in Asia for high quality foods. And certainly linking that not just to investment in the agribusiness industry, but looking at our migrant populations and saying to what extent are the migrant populations in South Australia a linkage into the markets of Asia. And I'll give one example. I've got a student that's working on Koreans in South Australia, a very small community, but the opening up of free market between Korea and Australia has meant that all of a sudden almonds, which we produce in profusion here in South Australia and is the most desired delicacy in Korea, is opening up as a really significant market, but facilitated by the Korean community that are here. So let's use the existing connections that we have and recognise this interaction, the transnational connection, which doesn't separate economic development from migration, but actually looks at them together. And I think a smart approach can this isn't the whole answer, but can be one of the elements. Regional migration, at the last census, there are about 400 non-metropolitan local government areas in Australia. 100 of them, or just over 100 of them, had an increase in their overseas-born population but a decrease in their Australian-born population. And what's happening is that there is a replacement effect. And places like Bordertown, Narracourt, where, in those areas that you were talking about, they're experiencing this really quite significant influx of overseas-born. And I hate to say it, but I don't think the ABS picked them all up at the census, I am going to be suggesting at the next census there are some efforts to look at that. But I think we've always thought about repopulating our regional areas with people moving out of our cities. The fact is that the movement out of young people of many rural areas has reached a critical level. If it happens, keeps happening, there'll be an end to the productive enterprise in those areas, including farming and so on. So replacement with migration is really, really crucial, and it is already starting to occur, but to an extent outside of the influence of policy. Peter.
I was just going to comment on that. Agriculture came up quite a lot in the agriculture came up quite a lot in the 457 review, and the issue is that the vast majority of agricultural occupations, except for the top end, farmer, is actually not on the list. You cannot bring in 457s to work on a farm. And this despite the fact that a lot of the jobs are actually quite skilled these days. So that, in other words, those occupations were misclassified in a sense. And the system that we proposed will enable occupations like that to be put onto the list. The biggest group we had complaining about this were the dairy farmers, because dairy's gone through the roof, and the dairy farmers actually can make so much money now they don't want to get up and milk the cows themselves. They can pay somebody else to do it. But that's one. but to change in the 457 system. But there's also there's labour agreements that might be used in agriculture. There's also the Dharma could be used as a regional system, like the Northern Territory's just done. So there are, I think, options there already. Another comment, which is not related to that, is there's a lot of international students in Adelaide. They all, when they graduate, have the right to stay in Australia for 2 years working. If the state government got involved in kind of helping them find suitable work in some kind of way, that's one way that you could recruit a lot of international students, I think, in a longer-term sense.
Just on that, with international students, a lot of universities provide that role in looking for employment opportunities. For migrants that have work rights, though, there is the specialist migrant services that are offered for our department to help skilled migrants find work. Just in terms of the agricultural question you've raised, Ross, I think that's an important piece of work that we would need to look into. I actually don't think any of the existing visa subclasses would quite fit the niche of what you're talking about for South Australia, because a lot of our farming communities are small, single farm operated, and the employer-sponsored program wouldn't quite fit for them because you've got to have an employer to nominate you. So things like the Dharma, which are employer-sponsored, or 457, that they won't fit. At the state-nominated level, they won't be on the list because we tend to not put occupations where there's a single employer, because you can't come out as a farmer and find a job because you've got to buy a business. So I do think that one's a particular interesting question that we might have to look into further.
Can I just raise an additional point just to come back to Graeme's comment earlier about not forgetting that refugees and humanitarian migrants have economic contributions. A lot of those jobs that you're talking about that aren't filled by 457s, particularly with the study we've been doing in the southeast region, are being filled by refugees. So we see a lot of refugee and humanitarian migrants who are working in viticulture, who are working in dairies, who are working as fencing contractors. We've heard stories about successful shearers being employed. So they are, and they're usually quite happy to be working and living in a rural environment. They would like to settle there long term. And they've usually come from a rural farming environment, so they're quite comfortable with that kind of work and used to seasonal work. So we are seeing that they are filling a real niche in those regions.
Helen neglected to mention that one of the respondents has won the Barista of the North.
Barista of the Year 3 years in a row in Port Perry.
Right, yes. So they're in some really important occupations, those refugees. Yeah.
And if you consider areas like Narracort with a meat processing plant, $1 million worth of wages come into that town every week, and 70% of their workforce is a migrant population, and that's a mix of 457s and refugees. So that's a lot of money being generated and spent back in that community in terms of housing rental, buying food, clothing, putting kids into school, those kinds of things.
Yeah, over here. Thanks.
Can I just ask a question
yeah,
first, Graeme,
first.
and Rebecca as well? Maybe that could be one of the recommendations that you could look at in South Australia, is to allow self-sponsorship in certain industries such as farming and agriculture, if there is some issues with transitioning businesses from one generation to the next. That could be something that you could have a look at. I know with occupations in the ANSCO and 457s and RSMSs, and those programs, there are a range of occupations that do fit. I think it's a bit of a misunderstanding between the skilled element of the work that's carried out on the job when certain applications are being assessed by the Immigration Department, which leads to a high number of refusals in certain areas. But I would like to ask a question. When you're looking at the statistics, South Australia gets about 3% of the 457 program. We get about 4% of students, 5% of spouse, 6% of the skilled migration program. We make up 7.5% of the population of Australia. What ideas or recommendations do you have which could see us increase our share of the population number in South Australia to create economic activity and jobs for future generations of South Australians?
Yes, you go first, Rebecca. Ladies first.
Thanks, Graeme. In terms of skilled, which is the area I can influence, it really would be looking at reinvigorating some of those regional concessions, or not so much concessions, I would prefer that they're incentives, so we don't end up with a second-class visa, which we've sort of got with the 489, which is a state-nominated provisional visa. And that's a program that was very successful, but did bring in a lot of skilled migrants to the state. It used to be about 50% of all skilled migrants that we were nominating were coming in under that pathway 3 years ago. Preceding year it was 30%, last year it was 20%, year to date it's only 13%. So it's not a visa that's working anymore in terms of that regional dispersal. I don't have any other suggestions in terms of how else to increase that share apart from reinvigorating the state-nominated employer-sponsored is hard. That's based on employer demand. The independent stream, you could perhaps be quite innovative there and actually restrict which locations they can actually settle in under the independent stream for something quite different.
I think there's a real danger in separating migration policy from the broader development policy of the state. And to me, you bring in migrants for jobs, you don't bring in migrants and hope that they will bring their job with them. The reality is that it needs to be integrated with the economic policy. It needs to be integrated particularly with employers and business so that people who do come in can be assured of getting a job. And I think that makes it all the more likely that they're going to stay, that they'll bring their family, that it'll be a productive process. And so it brings me to the point which I think is absolutely crucial, that we do not need or should have a standalone population policy. The population policy should be part of good economic policy, good environmental policy, and having population goals which are consistent with our economic and environmental and social goals is really quite crucial, and that sort of integration process to me is absolutely critical. But I think there is a role for better information, and certainly in doing a lot of the interviewing out in regional areas, there was a real lack of knowledge among many employers about the real possibilities of migration, and I think there is a role there in terms of better informing regions and individual employers of the potential of migration, particularly some of the temporary migration schemes to fill short-term labour shortages.
I wouldn't disagree with you in terms of bringing skilled migrants in where there are jobs, but I think the other thing is that, I think with Jeff Brock as the Minister for Regional Development, there needs to be a greater emphasis on the regions, because I know from anecdotal evidence from our members in metropolitan areas, business is doing it tough. There are certain areas that are doing well, but I think the regions are doing it even tougher. And so we need to have that sort of focus on regions, on how we can assist to develop. I don't disagree about information. That's very important, that people do get the right information, because often in the regions there does seem to be a lack of that information getting out there.
Now there was a question over here. Thanks.
Yeah, it was just more, I suppose, on that last topic of conversation. I know someone mentioned the meat workers and the labour agreements and that sort of stuff. From an immigration, Department of Immigration perspective, that negotiation took something like 4 years. It took the peak union of the pig makers, and it took, there was, the department spoke to probably 15 different groups over an actual 4-year process, and people may think that's a long time, and it is a long time. It takes a lot of resources and it takes a lot of effort, but if it's skilled meat worker is now the only non-ANZCO occupation that is used in the 457 visa program, and for South Australia it's in the top 10. I just looked up. There's 90 in 2013 and there's 50 so far last year. I think it indicates that this stuff takes a long time, and short-term goals aren't going to be sort of kicked very, very quickly. But also there seems to be this drive to find these solutions very, very, very quickly. And I just don't think they exist in this space, especially when you talk about federal powers and state governments' abilities to sort of persuade. And I've sat in rooms with many state government officials who get very, very frustrated because it's so difficult. And I don't think that realisation comes through a lot. I don't know, sometimes when we talk about these things. Sorry, that's a comment, not a question.
No, I think that's a very good comment, because I think there's a real danger in these types of things of developing shopping lists of, oh, that sounds like a good idea, and we don't differentiate between the things which really should get investment and make a long-term commitment to get them to work. And to me, the meat area is one where it was worth it, because you look at how successful these communities have been, and we've studied in our group Bordertown and Narracourt, where that is an enormous boost to the regional economy, which just wouldn't possibly exist without migrants. And it's not just 457s, it's refugees and other groups as well. So, the work has to go in, and they has to be for the long term, and it has to be selective. We have to select out from this menu of a set of ideas those which are feasible and workable, and then put in the hard yards over that long period of time. And that's what the idea of having a policy structure to work within to say that. That's why I think it is important to have that policy document to make those decisions about what are the things we need to progress and things that maybe we might do in the future. Yeah.
I've got a question that goes back to what Rick was saying before. It's about the 457 visa. How important is that to the growth of business and development in South Australia? And also, how can we keep migrants here and not have them coming to South Australia, which is classified as a regional area, coming to Adelaide and then using that as a platform to move to Sydney or to Melbourne or Brisbane?
Look, the 457 visas are very important, and unfortunately it has been a bit of what I would call a political football, because from our perspective, there is a need and to have skilled migrants, and it's not about taking jobs from Australians and South Australians, and that's not what it's about. But there are skill shortages, and there are going to be more skill shortages as we progress. And yes, I accept there is an issue in not only getting people to stay here, but there's an issue of getting people here, for example. And, one of the things we've been pushing very strongly is having direct international flights into Adelaide. Now, I know there are issues around airport curfews, which have stopped some international flights, and we're pushing for that curfew to be widened. Because I agree with you, we need to get skilled migrants into South Australia and try and keep them here, and not just on a temporary sort of situation. The other thing I just raise is when we're talking about international students, I know from talking with Michael Barber, the Vice-Chancellor of Flinders, that they've had some success stories of international students actually going back to their home country and actually promoting Australia and Adelaide as a destination. And I think that's also very important, that with international students, that we recognise that they can be very good ambassadors for Adelaide and South Australia. And the other thing is that I think we've got to be more open to overseas investment, wherever it's from, including China. Because the other thing that we're working with the Minister for Trade, Martin Hamilton-Smith, is trying to get more small businesses, not just export ready, but being able to do it. Because the future for South Australia is export, and we need to also recognise that. And anything we can do to open up markets is also very important. And that's part of the whole mix.
One of the questions which I'd like to include in our discussion relates to care, the care deficit that we have already in terms of a shortage of care workers, but certainly looking into the future with ageing of the population. And I wonder, Loretta's done work in this area. To me, it is really crucial that we plan ahead for this looming demand for care workers, not just in the aged care industry, but with the National Disability Insurance scheme and so on. That and when you look at the numbers, like a doubling of the aged care workforce in the next 20 years, they're just not going to be made up of people from the local workforce. And the sorts of, and I think anticipating some of these sorts of effects of ageing, which is not a deficit, it's a potential role for actually doing this better than anywhere else, and it becoming almost an export industry in itself. And I just wonder about looking at the potential for migration to fill this need. And I know that you've worked in this area. So. Yes,
I mean, speaking to people who actually work in the service of this area, I understand that this is also another place of source of employment for refugee entrants and students. I mean, the flip side of that, which you kind of hinted at in your comment, was, you know, are we using refugee intake as our source of unskilled labour when many of those refugees come with their own skills that we don't recognise? And so that certainly is an issue. But I think that what you're saying is very interesting, and you know, putting all kinds of care services on the list of skills that we need is one possible way. I mean, I was struck by some historical examples that are maybe a bit radical, but they also require different kinds of migration policy. So the way many regional areas were originally settled, and I'm thinking of Western Australian history because it's the one I know best, was through chain migration from villages out. So, you know, most of the southwest of WA was settled in that way. When the failed returned soldiers left the plots of land, who came in but the Greeks and Italians and the Slavs? And they were from farming backgrounds, and they made regional communities. So, you know, I don't know whether we can radically consider those kinds of mechanisms to populate regional areas, looking carefully at making sure these people match the areas and the work that's going to be there. That is a return to a different kind of migration policy, though. I mean, we also have some experiments in Australian history about populating places in that way, and I'm racking my brains to think of the famous Italian one in, is it New South Wales or Victoria? It's regional, where basically a ship, you know, it was organised for this community to settle there, and I can't believe I can't remember it because it's really well known and there's lots of Italians there and they're doing really well now. Can someone help me? But, you know, that was an experiment in establishing a community by plonking a lot of people there. I mean, it didn't work. It didn't go well in the very early years, but then now, today, it's a really successful community. But that is its origins. So, you know, it's a radical historical example, but that's another. I deviated from your original question that's sneakily, right. Graeme. That's okay. It's a hard question.
Oh, sorry, I had wanted to pick up Loretta on a couple of things you said before about grandparents and carers. As well as grandparents being carers, there's another issue of visa that wasn't mentioned today, of the carers visa, which has just been stopped by the federal government. That's right. And that was used by a lot of smaller ethnic communities with very high care responsibilities. So, for instance, the Vietnamese community were using carers visas where they had family members who wouldn't go into residential care because culturally it was inappropriate. They had little or no English, and so the other members of the family could work. So the stopping of that visa impacts on the family, and there are also no services available at present. So, for instance, the 3 Vietnamese communities in South Australia do not have any higher level aged care packages. So the carer visa has been taken away and created a care vacuum, with families being left with even less alternatives. When you're talking about groups resettling into regional areas, I heard a few years ago a whole lot of Vietnamese actually left Tasmania en masse, went into Queensland and bought large tracts of rural land to kind of resettle areas as a community where they could buy into agricultural areas. So some communities are obviously organising to do that.
Yeah, I think I don't know enough about why the carers visa was stopped, and I think it's probably similar to the very tight cap on the parent visa. The implication is that these people are going to be a burden because they're elderly, or the implication is perhaps that these people are going to overstay because they're from high-risk countries or countries that we don't want to have here. And that's where I think there could be a broadening of the way we examine migration and who we need, not just in terms of paid skills, but also in terms of these other very important areas.
Yep. Sorry, just on that, the people who were coming in on the carers visas were younger people, generally,
right. Okay.
caring for older people or disabled, and they were actually building up care experience, which they then could have gone on and done TAFE training and, you know, become carers in the Australian environment because they had part of the skill set. So I don't know why I stopped either, but it wasn't because of age.
I know that the department is looking at the potential of a carer's visa at some stage, a much broader carer's visa. But these programs in Canada and Japan have really not been very successful. And to me, what I think is necessary is we need a broad-based policy which isn't just about migration, but which is looking at this carer deficit, which we're absolutely going to face. It's certain, it is going to happen. We know there is going to be this very accelerated increase in demand, which we're not going to be able to meet out of new workers. So to me, it's best to look at it holistically so that it does take into account unemployed Australians, people losing their jobs, so that there is an important component of that. But migration is always going to be important, particularly in regional areas where more than a third of aged Australians actually live outside of our capital cities. And to me, there is potentially a role for, I think, the state in looking at this as part of a state approach to migration. Just as I think part of a migration policy has to look at ageing, has to look at the fact that the baby boomers are a third of our workforce, in fact 38% of our workforce in South Australia, and they'll be retiring over the next 20 years or so. So it's not just new jobs, it's actually that replacement factor which does need to be looked at. Sorry, did we go? Yes?
In the context of skilled migration, I'll say that one of the issues is that even the skilled migrant come from overseas, but after coming to South Australia or other parts, they end up in low-skilled jobs, or maybe end up in blue-collar jobs. But one of the things can be reversed. My point is that when you compare with outsourcing, because outsourcing and migration has some kind of relation where in outsourcing, the human resource is there in overseas, the job is exported, and in this sort of migration, the job is here, that is the idea, maybe, and the human resource is coming. But in outsourcing, the process gets success because in the in the whole system, the accent training is part of that. In the multinational company or the business group, put the jobs and the accent training together in a very formal way, and that becomes success. So when the phone call goes there, even they can't speak in a very US or Australian accent, but still it's okay. But when the migrant come to Australia or South Australia, many of the reasons why the business, they can't get a white collar job because they don't, even they can't speak English, they can't speak in an Australian way. And that is the one reason they can't get into that job market. So I think to make this skilled migration more successful, I think very intervention way, the government should give accent training when the new migrant come. And that can be a successful because, again, it's a radical thinking again. But when I thought of comparing with service industry, especially in outsourcing, there is a accent training and it became very successful. But when it comes to here, people don't get the white collar job, even they're skilled. That's the reason. So any comment on that?
Has anyone got a comment on accents?
The only thing we sort of recommend to people arriving newly is to try and connecting with the local communities, and just by having that conversation to pick up some of that language skills. So whether it's volunteering or joining a community group or a church group, certainly there are ways to try and help with that language and just the practicing of it before they're seeking that employment. But there's...
Within a short time to get a job, because when a migrant comes with a given resource, after that they exhaust because the valuation of
I think we get the point.
Higher
thank you very much.
But the other thing with that is, if you get into community groups and networks, you can actually often get a job out of that, or a better job, because that's how, particularly in South Australia, it works. It's often not what you know; it's who you know. So I think the comment about getting into community groups and networking is very important.
But I mean, also research, and I think Graeme, you mentioned this already, does show that one way that migrants are discriminated against is not just they could have very good English, but because they look different or have a different accent, the perception is. There's some really interesting research that really shows that, unfortunately, that is happening.
I'm not offering my services, but I have a large number of students from Asia, at any one time around about 20, and by the time they've spent 3 years with me, they go back very definitely with Australian accents in their English. So, yes, just here, thanks.
Just in the context of the way ahead, obviously to find a way ahead, we need to have a good evidence base to inform the policies and evaluate the programs and stuff. There's been a very clear message come out of it about, the need to improve data and statistics on temporary migrants, and there is action, Graeme, I can tell you, that is taking place in that space. However, to the panel, I just want to put it out there, where do you see the main sort of gaps in terms of migrant statistics and data generally that we need to take us forward?
Personally, I'd like to have a lot more statistics around our business migration program. I know Graeme mentioned this morning about some of the true outcomes that come from that program. It certainly is an area where there's not much around it, and also the linkages between provisional to permanent visas. The federal government treats a provisional visa holder as a permanent. When they first come in, they count them that way. And if they don't get permanent residency, they just take them off account. So there's no real statistical outcomes of success of those sort of programs. So they're the two areas, business migrants and provisional to permanent.
I'm not the right person to answer this question, but I think there should be more statistics that try to capture the mobility, the transnationalism, the to and from, and the brain circulation, or however you want to word it, because I think that doesn't get captured and could be telling us something really important about our schemes. I also think there should be more qualitative research, less numbers.
I could say lots about this, but if I was to have one wish, it would be to include a question in the census, or to modify the citizenship question in the census so that we can identify people in the census according to whether they're a temporary migrant or a permanent migrant. Because at the moment in our census, it's a mix where some temporary migrants are missed altogether, or they're regarded as visitors, so they're not included in the data, or they're thrown in with the permanent migrants. And so the census really is not an effective way of looking at temporary and permanent migrants as separate groups. It is a real mix, and it's one question which is already there and just needs some modification. So it isn't a massive cost to me. That if I was to have my one wish, because if we could actually separate permanent and temporary migrants in our census data, it opens up all sorts of possibilities for analysis. Now, I'm sorry, but we've run out of questions, so that's always a good sign. We've run out of time. We haven't run out of questions. But I want to thank the panel very much. I don't think we've got all the answers for Mr. Weatherall, but I think we've got a few ideas that are worth following up. So I'd really like to thank the panel very much for their contribution.
Graeme has one more task before the end of the day. He's just going to provide a quick summary of the day, which he clearly wasn't aware of. Just before he does that, just a couple of notices from the Don Dunstan Foundation. All the PowerPoint slides will be up on their website tomorrow. So if you want to access, including Stephen Castle's complete set of slides, will be up on the website. We've also been filming every session throughout the day, so if you want to refresh your memory on some of the conversations or go back on some of the things that have been said, particularly in the panel discussions, you will be able to access that next week on the Don Dunstan Foundation site. Okay, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Helen. That was a bit of a surprise. Thanks. I'm not going to keep you from your drinks very long. I do want to particularly say that I think I'd really like to thank all of our presenters, and especially those that have travelled some distance to get here, because I think you'd agree with me that it really has been a set of really high-quality presentations, which I think have really led to a really informed discussion. As I said before, I think this is an area of public policy which is very rarely has such discussions, that in fact it is so often a discussion which involves bigotry, self-interest and so on. And to have a wide range of disciplinary skills represented, I think I counted up over 10 different disciplines among the speeches, people from different parts of Australia, all of them really quite eminent in their areas in terms of their perspective on migration, I think has really been quite illuminating. I think that the results of the immigration update to me have fulfilled one of the original ideas which we had in setting up the immigration update, and it was that we felt that the discussion was an uninformed one. And the fact that migration is such a dynamic, changing thing in South Australia and in Australia, it is, I think, useful to have a point one time in the year where you draw a line in the sand and say this is where it is now and where is it likely to go into the future. Because one of the things that I often say to my students, when one of the many things which makes them think I'm an old fogey, I guess, is that I still am in wonder that I was born into a country in which the percentage of the population that was born overseas was about 8 or 8.5%, in which 98.5% of the population were Anglo-Celtic, and the country which I'm living in now couldn't be more different, and that's been achieved at the same time as there's been a massive increase in prosperity, but there has been, without significant conflict or breakdown in social cohesion, there has been this enormous improvement in the lives of Australians through this added diversity, through the added skills, through the all of the things which we know have come through migration. I think there's a real danger, though, in purely taking a positive view of migration. We have to look at it critically, and we have to look at the other dimensions as well. There are considerable negative dimensions which need to be looked at in terms of policy. It isn't a massively unending positive outcome from migration. Environmental constraints in Australia, to me, have to be part of every population consideration, whether it be at national or whether it be at state level. We have to look at it in the context of climate change. It is complex, and I don't think we need to make apologies that migration is such a complex topic, and it needs to be looked at in a nuanced way. And to me, in this discussion today, that we've moved to some extent towards such a discussion. And I'd really like to thank not just the speakers, who I think have been really outstanding, but the audience as well, because I think we have had a terrific set of questions which have really had a lively debate, and I think it's always a good sign when there are still several hands left in the air at the end of the session and everything hasn't been answered. So I'm not going to come up with some incredible summary of the diversity of information which we've got today, but I really think that it has been a profitable discussion, and I really hope that this continues into the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And now I'd like to call on Bill Cossey to come up and close the day before we head off to drinks.
Thank you, Helen, and I'm well aware that I stand between you and a drink, so I'll be brief. What started as a simple suggestion 5 years ago by Graeme Hugo to see if academic researchers could be brought together every now and again to share ideas and to share what they were doing in their research has now grown into what is a flagship event for the Don Dunstan Foundation, and also an event of much broader appeal and application than Graeme's original idea. That is in no means due, or no small means due, to the enthusiasm that Graeme Hugo, supported some years ago by Fiona Verity from Flinders, for this whole concept and for this whole conference. So Graeme, I thank you very much for inspiring the Don Dunstan Foundation to be part of this conference series, and also for your ongoing commitment. I don't think South Australians realise how lucky we are to have someone of Graeme's standing in this state. He's internationally recognised, and his contribution to this event is second to none. So, Graeme, thank you very much for all that you do for us. I would like to echo Graeme's comments about the quality of speakers and presenters today. It's been absolutely first class. I've found the discussion and the presentations stimulating and absorbing, and I think that they're a credit to the organisations that have helped make them available today, but also to the networks that Graeme Hugo has, that people are willing to accept invitations that come from him. I also thank the session leaders who've done such a great job in keeping us to time. I thank Multicultural SA, who have provided some financial support, not just for today's event, but over a series of years, and to the Don Dunstan Foundation staff, Donna, Shana and Ben, who've worked so tirelessly to put it all together, a very big thank you. And finally, thank all of you for your participation. As Graeme says, it's been fantastic to have so many great questions and comments coming from the audience. That's been really stimulating as well. And before letting you go to a drink, the staff will not let me go without two things. Firstly, they'd love you to fill in the evaluation sheet. I've done mine. It took about 2 minutes, so that won't keep you from your drink for too long. And also a commercial for the Don Dunstan Foundation. We invite you to look at continuing support for the Don Dunstan Foundation. Visit the website regularly, make contributions in other ways, and thank you again and good evening.